They called it a family meeting. But the boardroom felt like a courtroom without a judge. Glass walls holding in the heat of July and the sting of old nicknames. Zara counted the seconds by the tap of her silver bangles on lacquered wood, a metronome against the chorus of polite dismissals. Raza, smiling with his teeth, declared order. Samina arranged her pearls like a prayer. Danish spun a pen as if it were a blade. "You have no say here," Raza said, and the words hovered like smoke, thick and indelible. Outside, cranes on the port moved slowly, rehearsing the patience of steel. Zara measured her breath, let the silence gather in her lungs, and decided not to spend it cheaply. When the door clicked and the lawyer arrived late, the room shifted. Just a millimeter, just enough. A file thunked onto the table, paper edges like a guillotine. No one knew it yet, but a sentence had already been written. It only needed to be read aloud. Silence is a weapon that looks like surrender. Zara had learned that standing behind her mother at funerals and audits alike, how stillness makes other people rush to fill it with mistakes. Raza filled it now, turning policy into theater, reading from a script that demoted grief to inconvenience. "Legacy requires decisiveness," he intoned, and the table nodded, grateful for verbs that sounded like leadership. But Zara heard the draft in his lines, the borrowed confidence fraying at the edges. The city pressed its lights against the glass as if listening. She glanced at Aisha, who answered with the professional gravity of a locksmith approaching a safe. In that small exchange, the future arranged its chairs. When Zara spoke, she did not plead for a seat. She described the terms by which anyone could sit. The room called it defiance. She recognized it as design. The word "no" carries better across polished wood than any amplifier. It reached Zara like a stone tossed through still water, rings widening until they touched memory. Nusrat laying out index cards on the dining table, each bearing a word. Veto, remedy, audit, like prayer beads for a future argument. In the boardroom, Raza's smile tightened as Aisha asked for the minutes to reflect the exclusion attempt. Danish smirked, but his pen stopped moving. A small confession. Imran shifted his weight as if a ship had changed course beneath him. The file on the table became a horizon line. On one side, habit. On the other, consequence. Zara felt her mother's quiet architecture under her ribs and trusted it. She let the room's impatience run its course, because the next sound would not be hers. It would be paper. Aisha read the preamble like a lullaby with teeth. Dates laid themselves out like train tracks. Nusrata's signatures, board approvals. A notary's seal that outlived its office plant. The clause did not shout. It waited. Upon any attempt to exclude the designated heir from decision-making, she read, controlling votes shall transfer to said heir, and a compulsory audit shall initiate. The room tried not to look startled. Raza coughed into a fist that held no tissue. Samina's rosary beads clicked once like a coin on marble. "This is an ambush," Danish said, but he watched the exit signs as if measuring the sprint. Zara only nodded, as if the weather had changed and coats would be sensible. Beyond the glass, a tugboat horned. Inside, time began to move with it, heavy and certain. In the after-silence, Zara realized that power changes temperature before it changes hands. The room cooled, breath clouded against the glass as if winter had slipped in under the door. She remembered the mill's dye vats steaming at dawn, the workers' jokes turning thin when supervisors approached. If this contract had a face, it was her mother's. Steady, unafraid of arithmetic or men. Raza leaned back and called for a vote as if momentum could erase language. Aisha did not argue. She cited procedure. Imran met Zara's eyes with something like relief. Danish, caught between blood and survival, chose to smirk again. The motion passed by show of hands, a small performance for the minutes. Then Aisha placed a palm on the addendum and said, with exquisite politeness, that their attempt had already triggered the remedy. Night rethreaded the day into narrower lines. and Aisha spread the addendum across her firm's conference table like a surgeon laying out instruments. Zara stood by the window, watching the port stack containers into obedient columns, thinking of how power loves neat shapes. The paper smelled faintly of old glue and Nusrat's house, lemons and dust, summoning an afternoon years ago when index cards became constellations under her mother's steady hand. Aisha spoke softly, translating law into choreography. Trigger, transfer, audit, injunctive relief. Each step contingent on the last like notes in a raga. Imran's files arrived by courier. A quiet drumbeat of receipts and risk registers. "I'll call it a trap," Zara said. "Then let them," Aisha answered, "because it is also a door outside." Cranes moved like metronomes. Inside, commas and subclauses found their partners, and the outline of consequence sharpened until it could cut. Zara exhaled, and for the first time she felt the blade in her hand. The mill's morning began before the sun admitted it, dye vats steaming like tired lungs. Sadia walked Zara through aisles of color that never fully left the skin, naming the machines the way people name stray cats. Old Jinnah, greedy Bella, the Weezer. Guards looked the other way after the night shift, she said, showing a lock whose chain had learned to forgive. A fan rattled an off-key rhythm, while a first aid box yawned empty. Zara listened with the patience she had practiced all her life, learning the shapes of harm that balance sheets preferred as footnotes. She took photos, not as proof against men, but as proof of care. Somewhere between the hiss of steam and a worker's laugh cracking into a cough, she felt the clause change from an argument to an oath. The dye mist lifted. The light thinned, and the ledger inside her began to tally what couldn't be expensed. In a memory that walked like a ghost beside the present, Nusrat cleared the dining table and built a city out of index cards. She wrote in a librarian's hand, pausing to sip tea, as if punctuation required heat. "They will underestimate your quiet," she told a much younger Zara. "So we must teach paper to speak." She circled the word, remedies, and underlined automatic. The ceiling fan swirled the smell of cardamom and starch. Outside, outside, kites mapped private wars across the sky. Back in the office, Aisha overlaid the same logic with statute citations, replacing handwriting with footnotes that behaved like anchors. Zara realized that her mother had been composing a future voice, one that could be performed even in her absence. The trust wasn't a monument. It was choreography. When the music of disrespect began, the steps would already exist, waiting to be danced. Danish arrived at headquarters early, a habit born of ambition and insomnia. He unlocked the CFO's cabinet and fed selective pages to a portable scanner, knitting the numbers into a new story where costs retreated and compliance improved by miracle. He justified it as smoothing turbulence for investors, but the hum of the machine sounded too much like erasure. When he looked up, his reflection in the window was the height of the cranes. A tiny man pretending to lift ships. He thought of Raza's hand on his shoulder the day he was promoted, the weight of approval, and a future priced in favors. If the clause transferred power, then the audit would bring daylight, and daylight is what liars fear. He zipped the scanner away and told himself that history rewarded the quick. Outside, a horn sounded. Inside, a cell in him answered with a tremor he didn't name. By afternoon, the blueprint was ready. Aisha mapped the injunction path with the care of a pilot, charting monsoon corridors. Affidavit from Sadia, risk logs from Imran, photographic record from the mill, and the addendum's dormant teeth. "They will push for speed," she said. "So we anchor in procedure." Zara felt the odd calm of a traveler who finally knows the train's direction. Grief and strategy stopped wrestling and began to walk in the same step. She called Sadia, voice steady, and asked for names of workers who would talk without asking for anything in return except truth. She texted Imran a single line, "We do this clean," and watched the dots pulse like a heartbeat. Outside, The light lowered into a color that makes promises look brittle. Inside, signatures gathered like birds on a wire, ready to lift all at once. The vote arrived like a trick dressed as procedure, hands raised with the reflex of people who had practiced obedience into muscle memory. Raza called the motion as if reading the weather. His voice lacquered and warm, and the room followed, grateful to be told what to do. Zara watched the choreography unfold. Danish's palm up first, a quick flicker of allegiance. Samina's fingers tremoring around a prayer that sounded like stability. Minor directors nodding as if gravity had opinions. Aisha asked for the wording to be read into the record. Raza smiled the way a blade smiles. Zara did not interrupt. She counted. She measured the distance between intent and law, the way sailors gauge a reef. Somewhere beyond the glass, a ship's horn pressed against the night. When the tally was announced, her exclusion affirmed by show of hands, she felt no shock. Only the quiet click of a trap completing itself. Aisha cleared her throat and asked the recorder to mark attempted exclusion. The words were small stones dropped into a deep well. The echo came back carrying teeth. Zara folded her hands as the lawyer read the addendum again, slower, until each syllable landed like a seal. Upon any attempt, Aisha repeated, controlling votes shall transfer. Raza tried to interrupt with a question shaped like authority. But authority, tonight, had a footnote. Danish looked at the ceiling as if a vent could supply an exit. Samina's rosary clicked once and then forgot itself. Zara felt her mother's handwriting move inside the room. A choreography of commas and consequence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She merely acknowledged the transfer, requested the audit's commencement, and asked for the keys that paper had already fashioned. The room discovered what silence sounds like when it belongs to the winner. Fractures travel fastest through steel when the room goes quiet. After the clause found its voice, alliances recalibrated with the faintest of sounds. A chair inching back, a throat clearing, a pen that no longer clicked. In the elevator bank, Imran waited with a folder that looked ordinary and felt radioactive. Risk register, long version, he said, as if describing weather. He didn't ask for promises. He offered names, variances, purchase orders that screamed when held against daylight. Zara took the folder, and a breath that tasted like rust. She understood the new physics. Paper was now gravity, and Raza's orbit had begun to decay. Somewhere in the building, Danish was manufacturing a past where he hadn't touched the books. Somewhere closer, Samina was composing a hymn to stability. The doors opened. The future arrived as a ding. They stepped inside and let the cables sing them downward, toward consequence. Raza moved quickly, the way a man runs when the ground turns to water. He summoned counsel, whispered to directors, shaped the word, injunction, with a confidence he no longer owned. Aishi answered with filings that were less argument than architecture. Samina found Zara in the corridor and tried to fold the future into a smaller, safer box. Family, tradition, discretion. Words that once felt like shelter, and now sounded like locks. He built this, she said of Raza. She built this, Zara answered of Nusrat, touching the edge of the addendum as if it were a hand. Danish slid past them without choosing a side in public. Imran sent a quiet text. Warehouse, 3D discrepancies, significant. Zara realized that reform wouldn't feel like triumph. It would feel like repair, slow, visible, subject to weather. She nodded to her aunt, not in surrender, but in recognition. Storms don't consult the umbrellas. When they reconvened, Zara did something radical. Nothing loud. She accepted the chair at the head of the table without flourish, and began with logistics. Keys, access, audit schedule, safety review. The discipline of her voice unsettled the room more thoroughly than anger could have. Rage is easy to dismiss as wind, but a calendar is weather. She thanked Raza for his years, truth without flattery, and announced that pending the audit, discretionary spending would require dual signatures. She named Warehouse 3 and watched two directors forget their faces. Danish swallowed. Samina exhaled. Aisha added the note to the minutes. Zora remembered the dye mist at dawn and decided that if justice had a smell, it was steam leaving a vat. She ended the meeting before anyone could drown the moment in speeches. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a ledger line with room for numbers. The morning broke like a thread pulled too hard. One sharp snap, then a hiss that wouldn't stop. At the dyeing mill, a belt tore free and flailed against steel, a serpent of rubber striking fear into muscle and memory. Sirens argued with the kettle's breath. Sadia shouted for the kill switch, her voice cutting through steam and dye fog, and the floor obeyed in stuttering stages. One pump, then another, then a silence shaped like relief and smoke. Zara arrived before management, hair damp with the humidity of panic, and stepped into the choreography of aftermath. Makeshift tourniquets. A worker swearing he was fine while he shook, a guard radioing no one in particular. She felt the contract inside her pocket heat like a coal, its logic as stark as the burn on a forearm. This was the cost hidden in neat columns. This was the clause's reason given breath. When the power finally died, the room kept humming with what could have happened. Management arrived with clipboards and caution tape, the corporate costume for contrition. A supervisor rehearsed the phrase, "Isolated incident," but the room refused his script. Steam carried too many prequels. Sadia, grease still bright on her knuckles, stood between a worker and a camera phone and said what policy never would. The lock had failed last week. The alarm stuck the week before. The night guard traded buttons for tea. Zara watched the words assemble like a spine and felt the strange, sober joy of truth asserting itself. She asked names carefully, promised nothing except record and remedy, and saw the nerves settle in shoulders that had learned to flinch. Outside, sirens softened into distant traffic. Inside, the dye fog thinned until faces looked like people again. When Raza's car turned into the yard, chrome flashing certainty, Sadia did not move. Neither did Zara. There are moments when standing still is the loudest action possible. Raza's voice found its familiar register, concern dressed as command. He promised a review, a task force, a personal oversight that implied miracles by Tuesday. Zara did not argue. She handed him the incident form and asked for his signature, the small civil ritual that turns words into weight. He hesitated, eyes tracking the crowd, then scrawled a name that had fed on applause. Aisha's message buzzed in Zara's pocket. Templates for affidavits, instructions for notarization, a schedule mapped like a spine. Samina arrived on a breathless breeze of perfume and worry, rosary hidden in her clutch like a contraband prayer. "This will pass," she whispered. "The way people talk about weather while watching a flood. It will be measured," Sarah answered, not unkind. When the cameras moved to catch Raza's profile, Sadia stepped into frame and named the failed alarm. The lens blinked. The narrative swerved. It would not return to the old road. In the law firm's conference room, the day narrowed into sentences. Workers arrived in pairs, hands scrubbed clean, eyes carrying night shift, and told the story the machines had been telling for months. Aisha listened like a cartographer, charting hazards and near misses, tracing the river where it had jumped its banks. Each affidavit read like a weather report. Alarms sticky, exits blocked, goggles rationed. Zara signed as witness and kept her voice low, asking follow-ups that respected pride. When Imran slid in with warehouse variants printouts, the pattern braided itself. Parts ordered but never installed. Safety budgets reconciled by magic. The city dimmed outside until cranes became silhouettes, posed like questions. "We move for an injunction at first light," Aisha said, eyes on the stack now thick enough to resist wind. Zara touched the top page, felt the papers drag, and thought of her mother teaching gravity to Kamas. Night folded the mill into a rumor, but the affidavits kept speaking. Zara walked the riverbank behind the facility where dye bled into water the color of arguments, and she pressed record on her phone as frogs stitched soft warnings into the dark. The company fence hummed with electricity that protected property more fiercely than people. She remembered Nusrat at the dining table, the doctrine of measured force, and felt both held and haunted by it. Raza texted a sentence about family unity. Danish sent nothing at all, which said enough. Samana typed a prayer, blue ticks, unreturned. When Zara reached the end of the fence, she turned back toward the city, its cranes, its courts, its contracts, and promised the river that it would be counted. She slid the phone into her pocket, breathed the mineral air, and rehearsed the words she would say in a room that smelled like varnish and verification. Tomorrow, the paper would walk. Raza tried to turn panic into strategy. He summoned an emergency board call and dressed it in the language of prudence. Liquidity, contagion, protecting enterprise value. As if the word liquidation were a life raft, and not an axe. He proposed offloading the dying mill first, a surgical cut to calm the market. Zara listened with the patience of a metronome, counting the beats where his confidence thinned. Aisha, patched in from chambers, asked for the asset list and the encumbrances, her voice the exact temperature of court paper. Danish traced circles on a blank page, already calculating exits that did not smell like smoke. Imran texted warehouse counts that refused to agree with themselves. Outside, the port cranes moved as if nothing in the world could break a rhythm that old. Inside, the meeting cooled several degrees. When Raza called for a preliminary resolution, Zara declined to vote, then quietly read the clause that turned his motion into evidence. When the petition hit the clerk's desk, the ink seemed to dry faster than air. Aisha's application for injunction read like scaffolding, affidavits stacked in quiet power, exhibits clipped with an archivist's care, remedies argued in sentences that did not waste heat. Zara stood with her in the corridor, where case numbers marched like soldiers, and she felt the odd relief of procedure taking the wheel. Raza's counsel arrived with glossy confidence and a vocabulary for delay, but the judge's calendar had a gravity of its own. The hearing was set for morning. Temporary restraint would be considered. Aisha's eyes flashed triumph, only once, quickly banked. They will shout urgency, she said. We will show irreparable harm. In the echo of marble and fluorescent buzz, Zara heard something like music. The architecture of consequence in 12B time. Outside, the city steamed. Inside, the file grew heavy enough to anchor a storm. Morsi, Mrs. Kuning Jim Scheid and News travels at the speed of appetite. By noon, the mill accident, the affidavits, and 2 pages of the addendum, yellow highlights like lighthouse beams, circled social media as if the platforms had been waiting for a narrative that smelled like dye and dynasty. Hashtags did their choreography. Editors clipped Zara's brief press line about audit and worker safety. An old photo of Nusrat touring the mill resurfaced like a blessing. Raza's comms team issued a statement that sounded mass-produced by regret. The font too clean for the stain it tried to lift. Danish kept his phone face down until the vibration became a drum. Samina called and didn't leave a message. She knew words can bruise when they arrive uninvited. Aisha cautioned restraint. Let the filing speak, but the air itself felt electric with witness. Zara did not exult. She posted a single sentence, "The audit begins," and closed the app before the applause could teach her the wrong lesson. Pressure seeks a seam. Raza called Danish into an office where the blinds were already half closed, a theater for frankness. He offered promotion as absolution, a new title written in future tense if Danish would steady the narrative. The words tasted like bribes dipped in euphemism. Danish wanted to believe in his velocity, the dream that speed could outrun receipts. But the audit had the slow confidence of a tide. When he emerged, Aisha was waiting in the corridor with a document that turned fear into calculus. A proffer letter. Limited immunity for truthful cooperation. She didn't sell. She described weather. You can't save everyone, she said. But you can stop adding weight to the wrong side. Danish read, lips moving, then closed his eyes like a man stepping into cold water. He signed. Somewhere, a ledger found balance enough to breathe. Somewhere else, a loyalty snapped, painless as a hair until you count what it held. The order came through just after dusk. Temporary restraint granted. Assets frozen pending hearing. Audit authorized under court supervision. It did not sound like victory. It sounded like responsibility with a stopwatch. Zara read the language twice, each sentence a rung, and climbed into the next hour. She called Sadia first, because truth should hear itself reflected. Then Imran, to synchronize warehouse access. Then Samina, to promise that the fight would spare dignity even when it spared nothing else. She drafted a company-wide memo that refused the theater of bravado. Dates, steps, contacts, nothing ornamental. Aisha, finally letting a smile show, said, "Tomorrow, we take keys." Outside, the port lights stippled the water like 1,000 signatures becoming legible at once. Zara stood at the window with her mother's portrait propped on the sill and tapped her bangles once. Silence answered, newly shaped. Not absence, but permission. Morning in the city courts carried the hush of a theater before overture. Wood polish, murmurs, the strict geometry of benches. Zara sat at council table beside Aisha, fingers quiet, breath measured to the tick of a ceiling fan that had survived more summers than most businesses. Raza entered with counsel, and the weight of a surname he wore like armor, eyes scanning for cameras that might forgive him in real time. Danish lingered by the aisle, a man discovering how loudly paper can speak once you sign it. Imran reviewed a last checklist, the audit spine printed into a stack that could knock a shoulder if it fell. The judge took the bench and the room exhaled into order. Aisha rose without drama. She began not with outrage, but with chronology. Minutes, vote, exclusion attempt. Each fact clicked like a gear engaging, and somewhere inside Zara, a machine built by her mother, began to hum. The clause had been rehearsed in rooms of glass and steam, but here it acquired echo. Aisha read, Addendum, E12, B, as if tuning a stringed instrument. No flourish, only pitch. Upon any attempt to exclude the designated heir from decision-making, controlling votes shall transfer to said heir, and a compulsory audit shall initiate. Raza's attorney objected on jurisdictional arabesques. The judge lifted a finger, the universal pause, and asked for the minutes. Aishi produced them, each line a breadcrumb leading to the mouth of the trap. The court stenographer's keys rattled like rain. Zara's pulse matched the rhythm, and then surpassed it, finding its own tempo. She thought of the mill's belt-whipping air, of Sadia's steady voice, of Imran's quiet arithmetic. The room, calibrated to skepticism, began to tilt toward structure. Attempt, trigger, transfer. Not a revolution, precisely, more like a gate. Opening because its hinge had been oiled years ago. Evidence, when honest, doesn't raise its voice. It simply accumulates. Imran's variance charts stepped through months like a calendar with bruises. Parts ordered twice, safety budgets resolved by magic, warehouse receipts that failed to agree with doors and dust. Aisha laid each exhibit like a tile until a mosaic emerged that even distance could not blur. The judge's questions grew shorter. Raza's objections lengthened into adjectives. Then Danish stood, throat dry, and delivered quiet grammar. Dates, emails. The night he fed a scanner with pages that now felt heavier than steel. He did not perform contrition. He described weather, and the room believed him because he stopped trying to be interesting. The stenographer's keys softened, as if even language was growing careful. Zara listened without triumph, feeling instead the solemn tick of duty. If the clause is a blade, it must cut clean. Hidden accounts came to court like contraband surfacing after a storm. Aisha introduced a forensic report. Transfers routed through vendors that existed mostly as post office boxes. Invoices that described services as FAW. Raza's counsel bristled and called it conjecture. Aisha pointed to signatures that rhymed with each other in a way honest hands never do. The judge leaned forward, fingers templed, and asked one precise question about beneficial ownership. The answer, an offshore shelf company with a name that sounded like a perfume, landed without cushion. Zara kept her eyes on the paper. She felt no pleasure in the reveal, only the practical relief of daylight on mold. For a heartbeat, she pictured Nusrat at the dining table, thumbs ink smudged, teaching commas to carry weight. When the court marked the report as admitted, the room seemed to regain true north. The blade had found the bone. Now came the careful cut. When the judge spoke, the room leaned in as if gravity had shifted a few degrees. Findings were not fireworks. They were stairs. The court recognized the exclusion attempt, affirmed the transfer of controlling votes under the addendum, and ordered an independent audit with immediate access, keys included. Discretionary spending froze beneath a sheet of ink. Raza's counsel requested a stay and found the air thin. Denied, the judge said. A syllable that closed one door and opened another. Zara did not smile. She felt the responsibility settle on her shoulders like a well-cut coat. Aisha gathered papers with the economy of a surgeon finishing a stitch. Imran exhaled through his nose, a near sound. Danish stared at the wooden grain of the rail, as if it might offer absolution. It did not. Outside, the cranes waited, indifferent and exact. Inside, language became law, and law began to walk. Power did not crash like surf. It arrived like a ledger closing at midnight. Quiet, final, stamped. Keys clinked into Zara's palm at the security desk, a ceremony without fanfare, and the building seemed to adjust its shoulders as if relieved. She did not walk faster. She walked exact. Aisha beside her with orders and access letters. Imran a step behind with auditors who smelled faintly of printer toner and rain. Raza watched from the mezzanine, leaned on a railing he used to grip like a pulpit, saying nothing because words had been itemized into evidence. The elevator ride felt like the slow inhale before a scalpel touches skin. On the top floor, the boardroom waited with its familiar lacquer and harbor of reflections. We proceed in the order the court dictated, Zara said, voice steady with the discipline of weather. In the glass, cranes paused mid-gesture. The city did not bless or curse. It acknowledged, and so did the room. The first order of business was a simple sentence with complex consequences. We are opening the books. Auditors fanned through departments like rain, steady rather than dramatic. And what they found was mostly dust, habits, shortcuts, rituals that grew in corners where light seldom reached. Zara kept meetings short. Compliance calendars, safety retrofits sequenced before renovations, a moratorium on creative accounting. She set the tone by thanking no one for doing the minimum and praising the few who had done it anyway. When she paused, she could hear the company exhale, not in gratitude, but in the relief of clear instructions. Aisha drafted a board resolution formalizing worker testimonies as protected disclosures. Imran pinned a new risk register to a shared screen and invited edits. The day's weather was procedure. It's music. A stapler's click. Power, Zara realized, is not a speech. It's a checklist that keeps its promises in public. At the mill, Zara chose a place where steam and wages met. The loading bay, where forklifts wrote their cursive on concrete and stood on a pallet to speak. No fanfare, no banners, only sentences built to stand outdoors. She announced the worker equity pool with numbers that fit in a pocket. Percentage, vesting, safety bonus braided with uptime and incident reduction. She promised audits that counted people before machines, and an anonymous line answered by a human with authority. Sadia stepped forward, not as a prop, but as a partner, naming the committee that would oversee retrofits and training. The applause was imperfect and therefore honest. Some clapped, some watched, some squinted against the light to see if this change had edges. Zara felt something loosen in her ribs, not relief, exactly, but alignment. If revenge had brought them to this clearing, then justice would build the road through it. The family meeting resumed where it had begun. The boardroom, the glass, the sea beyond pretending not to listen. This time, Zara opened with a choice that did not perform mercy, but offered a path. "Compliance or exit," she said, placing 2 documents on the table. One, a cooperation agreement with defined obligations and a timeline. The other, a buyout package tethered to non-interference. Raza studied them with the poise of a man searching for a third door. Danish, pale but anchored, confirmed his cooperation on the record. Samina asked whether forgiveness had a line item. Aisha answered that dignity isn't booked but can be honored. The silence that followed felt different than all the others, less like erasure, more like math. After a long, low breath, Raza reached for the pen. He signed the exit. The room did not erupt. It adjusted like a ship taking a new bearing without spilling a cup. Even endings are administrative. After signatures, copies, and the small clatter of a notary seal, the room exhaled into an afterword. Zora closed her laptop with the tenderness of a book, returning to the shelf. She thanked the board without embroidery, announced the calendar for equity implementation, and stood, not to dominate the room, but to release it. Through the glass, the harbor lifted its cranes in slow benediction no one had earned, and everyone needed. As chairs scraped and footsteps learned their new routes, Zara stayed a beat longer. She touched the silver bangles against the tabletop. 1, 2, 3, and listened to the sound they made now. Not defiance, not fear, just a measurement of distance traveled. Her mother's portrait waited in the corridor, linen shawl luminous. Zara nodded to it, to the law that had held, to the workers who would hold her accountable. Then she turned toward the day, which, for once, would proceed on agreed terms.